Government should never, ever inhibit or intrude into an individual's religious practices. But individual religion practices exercised must always be allowed to influence society, especially government, through representation. All colonial institutions were constructed to mitigate man's inherent sin nature. Suspicion of institutions, especially controlling money and organizational structures, incorporated checks and balances. Transparency was required. Only a sovereign God was to be trusted. And this philosophy influenced our founding fathers, reflected by James Madison's quote, "We do not depend upon the virtue of or place confidence in our rulers, but in the people who choose them." This idea of a dualism of government and spiritual life prevailed. It's the unity of all things under a common moral law as expressed in the Bible and natural law. That was the norm. This idea of government and church, each was delegated with responsibilities and none receiving total authority. Our founders did not believe in a theocracy. However, they believed that church and state did have a relationship. And what was that relationship? That's government should never, ever inhibit or intrude into an individual's religious practices. But individual religion practices exercised must always be allowed to influence society, especially government, through representation. That one-way influence to government was the established norm by the Revolution. And how many people do you run into who don't understand this?
To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty and happiness without virtue in the people is a chimerical idea.
Number 5, an in-depth biblical understanding by its citizens. Reviewing the sermons of the period, it's interesting to note that the colonists knew the Old Testament better than the New. As Jonathan Edwards described, the colonial purpose was to be the new Israelites. And therefore, the Old Testament was more relevant to our founders than the New Testament. They were very familiar, first of all, with the blessing-curse theology of the Old Testament, but I think equally important, they were familiar with the historical pattern of tyrannies. So whether viewed as a secularist and you view the Old Testament as primitive or not, you can conclude that the characteristic made the American Revolution a defensive stand against a repeat of historical tyrannies using the intellectual arguments and doctrines from the Bible, from some of the most towering intellectuals of Europe. Number 6, no toleration of pornography. See, 3/4 of the writings of the biblical-based Protestant literature was available. Family bookstore stuff. In contrast, pornography ran rampant in France and England, widely used for political and religious satire. In America, it was recognized as counter to reality and reason, and therefore not a worthy contribution to society. Of course, all that changed in the Supreme Court's failure to clarify in the 1970s, as pornography is something other than a valued contribution under the Constitution. Lastly, our founding fathers rejected the influence of the European Enlightenment and its humanistic influence that spread doubt and disbelief. In fact, Samuel Adams, the last man to sign the Declaration of Independence, turned and said this:
"This day we have restored the sovereign to whom all men must become accountable. May his kingdom reign from sea to shining sea."
You see, we were never to be modeled after Europe, ever. For our founders, they saw the effect of the divine right kings in its countercultural movement, the Enlightenment, and they saw it as detrimental to nearly every aspect of their perception of European culture. The effects of Europe still carries its weight today, according to Will Durant, who's probably the greatest historian of modern time. Even George Washington himself made it clear that we were a Christian nation when he said this.
To the distinguished character of patriot, it should be our highest glory to add the more distinguished character of Christian. The single instances of providential goodness which we have experienced and which have now almost crowned our labors with complete success, demand from us, in a peculiar manner, the warmest returns of gratitude and piety to the supreme author of all good, George Washington.
I think that's a rather profound statement from a man who had 2 horses shot out from under him, 4 bullet holes in his coat, and yet was untouched. In addition, at the Battle of Princeton, a football field's distant away, 2 full British garrisons were ordered to fire on Washington alone on his horse. Think about this. Literally several hundred rounds with practically Washington's name on them. They all missed. In Washington's mind, active divine protection was assured for the God-fearing nation.
The hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this, the course of this war, that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and more wicked that has not gratitude to acknowledge his obligations. George Washington.
Another concept unique to colonial America was secret ballot voting. Unlike the open ballots that the unions press for today, citizens were allowed to vote their conscience alone. Compared to the European voting standards at the time, this was a pretty big deal. And the reason of the secret balloting, you can probably imagine, was important, since much of the voting was about regulations in the colony and exclusion of influence of the crown. Good without God. Can a secular humanist government even exist without a common, absolute moral code of virtue? No question is more relevant to today's issues. And we'll answer that question as we look at the French Revolution. But we'll do that through the eyes of an American founding father, as we place our bets between 2 revolutions in our next installment.